Chapter 14 of Frankenstein. Some time elapsed before I learned the history of my friends. It turned out that the old man's name was de Lacy. He was descended from a good family in France where he had lived for many years in wealth, respected by his superiors and beloved by his equals. His son was bred in the service of his country, and Agatha had ranked with ladies of the highest distinction. A few months before my arrival they had lived in a large and luxurious city called Paris. There they were surrounded by friends and all the pleasures that a small fortune could afford. The father of Safie had been the cause of their ruin. He was a Turkish merchant and had lived in Paris for many years. Eventually, for some reason which I could not learn, he did something that angered the government. He was seized and cast into prison the very day that Safie arrived from Constantinople to join him. He was tried and condemned to death. The injustice of his sentence was obvious. People said that he had been condemned for his religion and wealth rather than the crime alleged against him. Felix had been present at the trial. He was horrified and outraged when he heard the decision of the court. He made at that moment a promise to rescue the convicted man and then looked around for a way to do so. After many fruitless attempts to gain entrance to the prison, he found a grated window in an unguarded part of the building, which lighted the dungeon of the unfortunate man. The Turk was inside, loaded with chains and waiting to be executed. Felix visited the grate at night and called out to the poor man. He told him that he was determined to help him escape. The Turk was amazed and delighted. He promised Felix a great reward if he could free him. At first Felix refused the man's offers, but that changed when he saw Safie. She was allowed to visit her father in jail, and she managed to show her gratitude through smiles and gestures. Although Felix had not set out to win a reward, he had to admit that the prisoner was in possession of a treasure that would fully reward him for his efforts. The Turk saw that his daughter had made an impression on Felix. He tried to encourage the young man by promising him his daughter's hand in marriage as soon as he could be rescued. Felix was too delicate to accept this offer, yet he hoped that the promised marriage might some day take place. During the next few days, while the preparations were going forward for the escape of the merchant, Felix's enthusiasm was warmed by several letters that he received from this lovely girl. She found ways to express her thoughts in the language of a lover by the aid of an old man. He was a servant of her father's who understood French. She thanked Felix in the most passionate terms for his intended services towards her father, and at the same time she gently deplored her own fate. I have copies of these letters. Before I go I will give them to you. They will prove the truth of my tale. At present, however, as the sun is already low in the sky, I shall only have time to repeat the substance of them to you. Safie related that her mother was a Christian Arab, who had been seized and made a slave by the Turks. She had won the heart of Safie's father, who married her. The young girl spoke in high and enthusiastic terms of her mother, who, born in freedom, rejected the slavery to which she was now reduced. She taught her daughter her religion and taught her to aspire to higher powers of intellect and an independence of spirit forbidden to the female followers of Muhammad. Her mother died, but her lessons made a lasting impression on the mind of Safie. She could not bear the prospect of returning to Asia and being walled up in a harem. The prospect of marrying a Christian and remaining in a country where women were allowed to take a rank in society was very appealing to her. The day for the execution of the Turk was set, but the night before he escaped from his prison, and before morning came he was many miles from Paris. Felix had acquired passports in the name of his father, sister, and himself. He had previously explained his plan to his father, who aided the deceit by leaving his house under the pretense of a journey and hiding himself with his daughter in a little-known part of Paris. Felix led the escapees through France to Lyons and across the mountains to Leghorn, in Italy, where the merchant had decided to wait for an opportunity of passing into some part of the Turkish territories. Safie decided to remain with her father until the moment of his departure, before which time the Turk renewed his promise that she should be married to his rescuer. Felix remained with them in expectation of that event, and in the meantime he enjoyed the society of the Arabian. She exhibited towards him the simplest and tenderest affection. They conversed with one another through the means of an interpreter, and sometimes by smiles and looks. Safie sang to him the songs of her native country. The Turk allowed all of this to take place and encouraged the hopes of the young lovers, but in his heart he had formed other plans. He was a pious Muslim, and he could not accept the idea that his daughter might marry a Christian. However, he knew that he needed Felix's help, so he put on a show of approval. The French were very upset that their prisoner had escaped, and they spared no pains to track him down. The plot of Felix was brought to light, and De Lacy and Agatha were thrown into prison. The news reached Felix and stirred him from his pleasant dreams. His blind and aged father and his gentle sister lay in a dungeon, while he enjoyed the free air and the company of the person he loved. This idea was torture to him. He quickly made arrangements for the Turk, telling him he should look for an opportunity for escape. If he happened to find one before Felix could finish his business in France and return to Italy, he should leave Safie as a boarder at a convent in Leghorn. After making these plans, Felix said goodbye to Safie and hurried to Paris. There he turned himself in. He was hoping that the government would release De Lacy and Agatha. His plan did not succeed. The whole family remained in prison for 5 months before a trial took place. He and his family members had their fortune taken away and were sent into exile. They went to stay in the cottage in Germany where I discovered them. Felix soon learned that the Turk, for whom he and his family had endured so many difficulties, had betrayed him. When the Turk learned that Felix had been reduced to poverty and ruin, he had left Italy and taken Safie with him. Such were the events that weighed on Felix's heart and made him, when I first saw him, the most miserable of his family. He could have endured poverty, but the ingratitude of the Turk and the loss of his beloved Safie were misfortunes more bitter and irreparable. It was only when the Arabian arrived a little later that his mood improved. When the news reached Leghorn that Felix was no longer wealthy, the Turkish merchant gave his daughter orders. She was to think no more of her lover. Instead, she was to prepare for a return to her native country. Safie was outraged by these orders. She tried to argue with her father, but he left her angrily, repeating his cruel order. A few days later, the Turk entered his daughter's apartment. He told her that he had reason to believe that their residence at Leghorn had been discovered. He was in danger of being taken captive and turned over to the French government. As a result, he had hired a ship to transport him to Constantinople. The ship would sail in a few hours. He intended to leave his daughter in the care of a servant. The servant had been ordered to follow him to Constantinople on another ship as soon as possible. When she was left alone, Safie considered her options. She did not want to go back to Turkey. She wanted to follow her lover into exile. Taking with her some jewels that belonged to her and a sum of money, she left Italy with a young female friend. This friend was a native of Leghorn, but she understood the language of Turkey. Together, the two young women departed for Germany. They made their way to a town about 70 miles from the cottage of De Lacy. There, her traveling companion fell dangerously ill. Safie cared for her with the most devoted affection, but the poor woman died. Safie did not know the language of the country and was completely ignorant of the customs of the world. She fell, however, into good hands. The woman of the house where she was staying took care to see that she arrived safely at the cottage of her lover.